The notification came at 9:17 in the evening. I had been in the preoperative assessment room for 2 hours at that point. The IV was already in my arm, a precautionary line, the nurse had said, standard for next morning procedures. The hospital gown was the kind that ties in the back and is never quite right no matter how you arrange it. The room was small and clean and quiet in the way that hospital rooms are quiet, a specific silence that has more texture to it than ordinary silence, made up of distant equipment sounds and footsteps in corridors, and the particular stillness of a space designed for waiting. I had been waiting 4 years for this room. My phone was on the tray beside the bed, face up, because I was expecting a confirmation message from the surgical coordinator about the morning timeline. The notification that appeared was from my bank. I looked at the account balance. I read it 3 times because the first time I thought I had misread it. The second time I understood I had not. The third time I put the phone face down on the tray and looked at the ceiling, and I did not cry, and I did not speak, and I did not move. And in the 30 seconds of stillness that followed, I understood, without having confirmed anything, without having spoken to anyone, who had done this. I understood because I had spent 38 years learning the specific grammar of my parents' decisions. My name is Tara. I am 38 years old, and I teach biology at a public high school and develop curriculum for an online education platform on evenings and weekends, which is the less interesting way to describe work that I had structured entirely around a single goal for 4 years. The goal was this room, this hospital, this surgeon who had come recommended through 2 years of specialist consultations and whose outcomes data for my specific procedure was the best I had been able to find within a range I could reach. I have a degenerative spinal condition that I had been managing with conservative treatment, physical therapy, medication, modifications to how I moved through my days since I was 31. The managing had worked until it hadn't. 2 years ago, the specialist I had been seeing for 4 years had looked at my most recent imaging and used the word window. She said the surgery was most effective before a certain threshold of progression, and that I was approaching that threshold, and that I needed to decide. I decided, and then I saved. $75,000 is a specific and significant number. It is 4 years of early mornings before school marking curriculum assignments for the online platform. It is 2 summers without vacation. It is a precise and deliberate accounting of what a woman who makes a teacher's salary can accumulate when she is organized and motivated and has a reason that makes the accumulation feel less like sacrifice and more like progress. My parents had access to the account from a period 6 years ago when I had been briefly hospitalized, a separate matter, since resolved, and had added them as emergency contacts on the account at the hospital's suggestion. The access had been documented with a specific notation at the bank, for emergency use only. I had not removed them afterward because there had been no occasion that made removing them feel urgent. The access sat there the way things sit when they have not yet become problems. The occasion arrived on the evening before my surgery. I called my mother. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was the voice of someone who has been sitting with what they're going to say and now is saying it, measured, prepared, not surprised by the call. She told me the money had been moved for safekeeping. She said my father had concerns about the facility and about the surgeon and about whether the procedure was truly necessary at this time, and that they had decided together to hold the funds until I agreed to get a second opinion at a hospital closer to home. She said she knew I was upset. She said this was what parents did when they were worried about their child. I asked where the money was. She said it was safe and that I should come home and we would sit down together and discuss it. The surgery was in 14 hours. The anesthesiologist had reviewed my file that afternoon. The surgeon had already marked my imaging. I was lying in a hospital bed with an IV line in my arm, and my mother was telling me to come home and discuss it. I hung up. I called the bank. The bank confirmed the transfer had been initiated the previous evening using the emergency access credentials. The full balance had been moved to an external account in my father's name. The fraud line representative was careful and sympathetic and told me what I had already partly understood. Because the access had been legitimately granted, their system had processed the transfer as authorized. Reversing it would require a legal finding, not a bank dispute. She suggested I contact an attorney. I had Carol's number from a lease dispute 2 years prior. I called her at 9:43 in the evening. She answered, which told me something about her, and she listened without interrupting, which told me more. She said 3 things. Do not leave the hospital. Document everything. Let me make a call. Then she asked me whether the hospital had a patient advocate on staff. I told her I didn't know. She told me to find out tonight. I pressed the call button for my nurse. Deborah arrived at 10:45 a.m. She was a compact woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the particular calm of someone who has spent 16 years meeting people in the most difficult hours of their lives and has learned that the most useful thing she can offer is not sympathy, but motion, the immediate, practical forward motion of someone who knows which phone to pick up and who answers when she calls. I told her everything. She listened the way Carol had listened, completely, without filling the pauses. Then she picked up her phone. She called the hospital's financial services department. She called the hospital's after-hours duty council. She spoke to both of them in a language that was efficient and specific and that I reckoned before morning. The duty council made a call. I did not know, at 10:45 at night in a hospital gown with an IV line in my arm, that the call would reach the hospital's director of patient services. I did not know his name. I only knew that Deborah had picked up the phone and that people were picking up theirs, and that this chain of picking up was the only thing standing between me and a surgery that was not going to wait for my parents to finish safekeeping my money. Carol called me back at midnight. She told me what she had spent 2 hours assembling: the bank's records of the transfer, the original access documentation with the emergency-only notation, 4 years of my own savings records showing the fund's origin from my income, pay stubs, tax returns, curriculum platform payment records, and an email from my father sent 8 months earlier in which he had asked me about the fund and its specific purpose, and which established that he had known about the account and its specific purpose. She also told me that the medical records, 4 years of specialist documentation, imaging, conservative treatment records, and the formal surgical recommendation, established the procedure as medically necessary rather than elective, which mattered for the legal framing of what had been taken and why. She said, "Your parents moved money that was yours from an account they had access to for a specific and documented purpose and used it to prevent you from having a medically necessary procedure. That is not a family disagreement about hospital choice. That has a legal name." She said she would have filings ready in the morning. At 2 in the morning, the assessment room was dark and I had not slept. The surgery was in 7 hours. Financial Services had told Deborah that without the fund balance confirmed, the procedure could not proceed as scheduled. Carol had told me the legal recovery process would take weeks. The window, my surgeon had described, the threshold of progression, the narrowing of optimal timing, was not a metaphor. It was a clinical reality that did not adjust itself to accommodate the timeline of a civil motion. I lay in the dark, and I thought about 4 years of early mornings. I thought about the specific quality of waking at 5:45 on a Saturday in February to mark curriculum assignments before the school week began, the lamp on in the dark apartment, the number in the savings account incrementally larger than it had been the Saturday before. I thought about my spine and what it had cost me over 4 years to manage it well enough to keep working toward the number. I thought about my parents sitting in their house the previous evening, having decided that their concern was larger than my autonomy, their judgment more valid than my 4 years of specialist consultations and surgical planning and disciplined saving. I was not angry. I want to be precise about this, because the absence of anger is itself a thing worth naming. I was the version of myself that understands that feeling and deciding are separate activities, and that the next decision was the only one that mattered. I had made my career in a classroom where I told young people that biology does not negotiate, that a cell does what the conditions require it to do, that adaptation is not optional, that the organism that survives is the one that responds to what is actual rather than what it would prefer. I had learned the lesson I had been teaching. At 7:45 in the morning, the door to the assessment room opened. The man who walked in was not a nurse and not a surgical coordinator. He was in his 60s, in a gray suit, with the bearing of someone who occupies institutional authority with enough experience that it no longer requires performance. Behind him were two other people, a woman with a laptop bag and a man in a hospital lanyard, who I would later understand was from the legal department. He introduced himself as Dr. Gerald Marsh, Director of Patient Services. He sat down in the chair beside the bed without being invited to, which told me the visit had a purpose and that he had decided not to waste time on the formality of being asked. He said he had been briefed on my situation. He said he had 3 things to tell me. The first was that the surgery would proceed on schedule. The hospital was extending a financial accommodation pending resolution of the account dispute, based on the documented medical necessity and the 4 years of savings records establishing the fund as mine. He said the hospital had reviewed the documentation that Deborah and the duty council had assembled through the night, and that the picture was clear. He said the word clear with the weight of someone who has seen unclear pictures and knows the difference. The second was that the hospital's legal department had filed an emergency civil motion in the early morning hours to freeze the external account to which my funds had been transferred, citing the documented original purpose of the emergency access credentials and the medical necessity documentation. He said the motion had been filed by 6 in the morning and that a response was expected before noon. The third was that the matter had been referred to the County Adult Protective Services Unit. He said what had been described to the hospital's legal team met the threshold definition of financial exploitation of an adult, and that the hospital had a mandatory reporting obligation once that threshold was reached. He said this without editorializing. He said it the way someone says a fact that is simply true and requires no additional weight because it carries its own. He asked if I had any questions. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about Deborah at 10:45 with her reading glasses pushed up and her phone in her hand. I thought about Carol at midnight assembling a file from 4 years of my financial life. I thought about a duty counsel I had never met making a call that had reached this man's phone before midnight and had brought him into this room at 7:45 in the morning, 1 hour before my surgery, to tell me that 3 things were going to happen. I said I had one question. I asked if the surgeon had been informed of the schedule confirmation. He said yes. He said she was already in the building. I said, "Thank you." He nodded once and stood and left with the same directness with which he had arrived, and I lay back in the bed and I looked at the ceiling, and this time I was not reading a bank notification, and I was not doing arithmetic, and I was not making decisions. I was simply present in the room with the IV in my arm and the surgery 1 hour away, and the specific relief of a person who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down. The surgery was successful. My surgeon spoke to me in recovery with the particular satisfaction of someone reporting an outcome that matched their expectations, which is the best thing a surgeon can say, and the thing I had been working toward for 4 years. The emergency civil motion produced a freeze on my father's account within 36 hours. Carol's formal legal process recovered the full $75,000 in 6 weeks. The account in my father's name had not been touched in the intervening time, which my attorney said was consistent with someone who moved the money as a pressure tactic rather than a permanent taking, who had expected me to come home and negotiate rather than to stay in the hospital and document. They had not understood that I did not negotiate with documentation. I presented it. The APS investigation resulted in a formal meeting with a caseworker and a monitoring record. I was not present for that meeting and did not ask for details. What mattered to me was that it existed, that it was a record in a system that said what happened and named it correctly. I was discharged on Thursday. On Friday morning, before I did anything else, I sat with Carol on a video call, and we went through every financial account and document with my name on it. Emergency access removed. Beneficiary designations updated. Contact authorizations on every account replaced with my own attorney's information. It took 3 hours. It was the most useful 3 hours I had spent in recent memory. My parents called twice during my recovery. I did not answer. I was lying in my apartment learning to be still, which the surgeon had prescribed, and which my body was learning with the patience of something that has been asking for this for a long time. I was not available for conversations about safekeeping. There is a version of this story that is about what my parents did and what it meant about them and what the years before and after it represent in the architecture of our relationship. I am not telling that version because I do not yet know how it ends, and because the part of it I know is this. They had access I gave them in a moment of vulnerability for a specific and limited purpose, and they used it in a way that required a hospital director to walk into my room at 7:45 in the morning to tell me it was being addressed. The documentation had made that visit possible. 4 years of pay stubs and transfer records and specialist consultations, an email my father had sent 8 months ago without knowing it would become part of a legal file, a bank notation from 6 years ago that said, "For medical emergency use only," and meant exactly what it said. I had not built the documentation as a defense. I had built it the way I build most things. Carefully, incrementally, because I am someone who keeps records and knows the difference between a number on a screen and a number in a file that can be produced when it is needed. It had been needed. It had been there. If you have ever had financial access, given in trust for a reason you believed was clear, used in a way that required you to fight to recover what was already yours, I would like to hear how you did it. And if this story reached something in you, subscribe. There are more coming.